speaker, Dr. Susan Clayton. Dr. Clayton is the Whitmore Williams Professor of Psychology at the College of Worcester in Ohio, where she chairs the program in Environmental Studies. She has a PhD in social psychology from Yale University and is the president-elect of the Society for the Psychological Studies of Social Issues. Dr. Clayton's research focuses on the human relationship with the natural environment and how it is constructed within the social context. Much of her recent work has been in zoos, something that definitely interests me, where there's a wide and diverse range of people that come into contact with the animals. Dr. Clayton is also interested in how people define themselves, and she has developed an environmental identity scale to assess the degree with which the natural environment plays an important part in the way people think of themselves. She is a fellow of the American Psychological Association, and in addition to numerous articles, Dr. Clayton has written and edited several acclaimed books, many of which you may know, including Conservation Psychology with Jean Myers. It's in its second edition in press. And the Oxford Handbook of Environmental Conservation Psychology, along with the Identity in the Natural Environment. And we are very fortunate to have Dr. Clayton here. She made a tremendous effort to actually get to College Station with all of the flights canceled, arriving at College Station, so she ended up driving last night from Dallas. So we are very lucky to have her here, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Clayton.
Thank you very much, and I really appreciate the invitation. It's a really interesting and somewhat unique program you have here, and I think in terms of information transfer, the conversations I've been having throughout the day, I'm getting at least as much as I'm giving, so it's a pleasure to be here. My goal today is, can you hear me okay? I'm not sure. Yeah. My goal today is to talk to you about the role of psychology in conservation, and particularly how we should be thinking about people, and maybe some positive thoughts about how we can involve people in conservation. And I think that I'm probably speaking to the choir a little bit when I say this, but often people who are involved in conservation don't really think too much about the role of people. Like, let's get out there and save those other species. And if you think about people at all, is that sort of annoying species that led to this problem happening in the first place, right? The ones that caused the degradation to the environment. And maybe an obstacle in the way of implementing the policies that we know would be necessary or useful in protecting other species. And so it's a very negative view of the role that humans play in biodiversity. And when people do think about humans and their role, they often think about, and the need to change behavior, they may think about some very concrete influences on human behavior. Things like prompts, by which I mean, well, I'll give you an example in a second, just little reminders, information to tell people, about the threats that various species face, or how our behavior might be affecting them, and incentives for behaving in a more sustainable way. And those incentives don't have to be financial, but they're often financial incentives. And the trouble with this is that these things don't work particularly well. So when you try to give people information, in the absence of any other intervention, information doesn't really seem to have much of an effect on behavior. I like information, it's a good thing, but it's not really the most effective way to change behavior. Prompts can be useful, but they tend to decline in effectiveness as we become habituated to them. So I don't know about you, but you've probably seen a sign like this sometime in your life. I used to work in a building that had little stickers like this on all the light switches, and the stickers had been there for years, and they were fading, and they were decaying, and nobody paid any attention to them whatsoever, and so that's what happens often with prompts. And incentives can be useful, but they often don't lead to lasting change. So particularly if you're trying to encourage somebody to engage in a particular behavior by paying them, if that incentive program is temporary, and they often are, you take it away and the behavior reverts back to baseline levels. So these are really not the most effective ways of changing behavior. What does matter in determining people's behavior, I'm going to give you 3 simple words. These aren't really the only things, but 3 important things that matter are, what order do I have them here? Affordances, norms, and values. And by affordances, I mean the properties of the physical environment that either promote or inhibit behaviors. They make it easier or they make it harder. They tend to facilitate certain kinds of behaviors. So it might be something like, do you have a recycling bin in the room? If you have a recycling bin in the room, people are more likely to recycle than if you don't have a recycling bin in the room. It has nothing to do with their attitudes. It's all about what the room provides, right? Norms, we all know the importance of social norms, and in fact, social norms are one of the absolute strongest effects on human behavior. And values are also important. So I'm a psychologist. I believe that what goes on inside people's heads also matters, and values are things we think about a lot, and they are important to us. These factors are always affecting our behavior. And so the trouble is, if we don't think about them, we run the risk of instantiating them in negative ways, in non-adaptive ways that encourage more negative or harmful behavior. So affordances were kind of notorious for making it hard to do the right thing and easy to do the wrong thing. One of the things that would be really nice if people did less of is to drive their car, but it's very easy to drive your car. It can be very hard to take the bus or other public transportation. Norms are a particularly interesting example because there's often a sort of counterintuitive effect of social norms. So environmental messages often say things like, oh, we're trashing the planet, we have to do something about it, look at all these problems people have created, look at all the pollution, look at all the trash. And that tells us several things. It tells us maybe that the environment is not in such good shape. It also says, well, people don't treat the environment very well. That's the normal thing to do. And so, in fact, then you might think, well, there's nothing I can do if everybody else is trashing the environment. Why should I even try to change my behavior? It also tells you that you're unlikely to get sort of socially stigmatized for behaving in a negative way because everybody else is doing it already. So these negative norms are being created, and there are some nice research studies that demonstrate this sort of backlash effect very well. And when it comes to values, we often imply that people have the wrong values. So we may imply that people are primarily motivated by self-interest, and again, specifically often in financial ways. Again, sometimes that works. So what psychologists always say is sometimes, probably most of the time, sometimes financial incentives can be useful, but sometimes they backfire. So in one study, reminding drivers that there were financial benefits to getting their tire pressure checked actually led them to be less likely to check their tire pressures than if you reminded them of the environmental benefits. If you reminded them of the financial benefits of saving energy, they were less likely to engage in an energy-saving program than if you reminded them of the environmental benefits again. In a work program, giving employees financial rewards for saving energy led them to be less likely to do it. So what's going on here? One thing that happens is that activating people's financial schemas, sort of telling them, we think this is what's going to matter to you, makes them think about things in financial terms. And it makes them focus on their own self-interest. And when they're focused on their own self-interest, they might just think, the financial benefits are minimal, and I really don't feel like checking my tire pressure today. But so it takes their attention away from focusing on the environmental benefits. And it also suggests a social norm, which is that most people are concerned about financial benefits. That's the normative way to act. So if you really want to have an impact, a lasting impact on human behavior, I think the motivation needs to be intrinsic. But it's not easy to think about how you can encourage intrinsic motivation for caring about the environment, and particularly about threats to biodiversity. People are not, in fact, present company expected, people are not particularly interested in the conservation of biodiversity, of species. They don't directly perceive it. You don't sort of see the species vanishing in front of your eyes. And it seems like something that's very psychologically distant. So certainly it can be geographically distant. It's also often seen as very temporally distant, like in the future we will have a big decline in species, in the future we're going to lose polar bears, we're going to lose pandas, it's going to be so sad, that's going to happen at some point, and it's not going to affect me. So the effect of that temporal distance and geographical distance is the psychological distance. So we want to find a way to create concern in the face of these kinds of barriers. And my argument is that the way to do that is to start thinking about identities. And before I go on to say how you do that with regards to diversity, let me say a little bit about what an identity is. So we form a sense of who we are as we live our lives. You know, little babies, they have no identity. Your identity emerges out of your lived experience. You start to remember things that have happened, and you start to kind of build those into a coherent sense of self. And so early social experiences can be particularly important because that's where that's ground zero. You're starting from scratch and you're getting those early experiences. It's going to be very impactful in determining your identity. You also build on these memories by coming up with some summary label. And when I say label, I don't mean that literally, but you don't just say, okay, I had this one time when I went to Disney World, and I had this other time when I was scared by a dog, and you start to say, okay, I find that I've been spending a lot of my time in natural settings. I guess that must matter to me. I guess it must be important to me, to my identity. So you're trying to construct a coherent sense of yourself. But also, of course, your identity is affected by how other people label you. And we can't help but be influenced by the things people say we are. And some of those things they say we are might denote social roles, like you're a child, you're a parent, you're a teacher, you're an animal caregiver, and it could be social categories as well. This is where stereotypes come into play, that people might say, oh, you're from Texas. I have the following set of beliefs about people from Texas. Or you're a Democrat, or you're a Republican. So in that sense, other people's sense about who you are is helping to shape your identity. So I think implicit in that, but let me make it explicit, it's important to note that we have multiple kinds of identity, multiple sources of identity, and actual, potentially multiple identities. And our identities also incorporate beliefs and values and essentially some sense of what's important to us. So some of our identities are more social, meaning that they have implications for our place in the social structure. And they're usually going to be social norms associated with those social identities. And one of the examples that I think is really clear with regard to environmental issues is the implications of a political identity. So many of you probably know that party affiliation is hugely important in terms of predicting whether somebody believes in climate change or is I would say a denier of climate change. It's more important than your educational level, and certainly gender, race, or age. And I think you can see this play out in the national sort of public political sphere, where people, Republicans who want to kind of say something about climate change may be actively penalized for doing so, voted out of office or dissed by fellow Republicans. It's just not seen as consistent with that political identity. So a political identity would be an example of a social identity. You can also have, I can't see that very well, an identity that's really part of your culture. And the sociologist Kari Nørgaard studied Norwegians and their attitude towards climate change. And she said many of them reject it because it threatens their sense of who they are. Because they think of themselves as being very socially just, and so they don't want to think about what they might be contributing to climate change. So they therefore deny that it might be happening. So Living in Denial, if you can't read it, that's the name of her book, so it's a nicely titled thing. We also have personal identities that are more individual, associated with our personal norms. And so here's where it gets to where I think it really matters with regard to the natural environment, that many people think of themselves in ways that highlight their connection with nature. And I define this as an environmental identity. And I started to think about this, is some years, 10 years back now maybe, because of talking to people who would say things about their sense of themselves and how it related to nature. So here are just some quotes that, in some cases these are from students of mine, in some cases I actually got them from a Sierra Club survey. So a sense of myself that I feel when I'm outdoors. Nature makes me feel like myself. And so the idea is that nature can be linked to your identity in terms of saying, this is an important part of who I am. Just a couple of pictures that I like because they show people whose identity is really caught up with elements of nature. This is a man, I can't remember his name, but he loves naked mole rats. It's like his life is revolves around naked mole rats. And you can just see how rapid he is in that. He kind of built this whole, he's not a biologist, I think he was a filmmaker, is a filmmaker. But he's this whole kind of lab built at his house to house his naked mole rat collection. Here's a couple who were living with wolves in England, and so I think of them as the crazy wolf couple. This is part of how they define themselves as people who lived with wolves. And I'm sure you probably have some other examples as well that you can think of. And so the question is, why is nature so important to our sense of who we are? And some of you may be thinking about, well, I've heard about this idea of biophilia. So E.O. Wilson proposed that we have this genetically inherited tendency to affiliate with life and life-like processes. It's because it was adaptive in the environment in which we were evolving. And so to the extent that we have such an inherited tendency, it might be expressed in an emotional response to nature. It might be expressed in a tendency to pay attention to nature, because that's certainly going to be adaptive. But there are also more, I'll say, psychological reasons why nature might be important to your identity. And one of it is the idea of significant experiences. So I said that our identities were shaped by early experience, and nature is a very rich source. It's a very vivid source of experience. It is, clearly multisensory, which is one of the things we like about it. Children often go with their parents and have these kind of really positive social interactions that take place in a natural environment. Research on environmentalists as adults often show that they've had significant experiences when they were young that led them to feel connected to the natural world. There's also some research showing that, looking at the extent to which people have what are called transcendent experiences in natural environments. So people sometimes really report these feelings of out-of-body kinds of emotions in natural settings, maybe in a redwood forest or just a beautiful mountain range, something that seems really spectacular. You feel awe, you feel humility. And people, this is not something that happens very often, clearly, but people will report that it can be a turning point in their life where they really start to rethink themselves and what's important to them. Similarly, but at a kind of more mundane level, people actually talk about natural settings as a good place to think about themselves. And Calvin and Hobbes knew that nature was a good setting for thinking about yourselves. And here are some quotes from students about how they're affected by being out in a natural setting. It tamps down all that noise of society that's telling you what to do, what to be, what not to do. And you're kind of out there in the setting and you think, well, what is important to me? It can be calm, but there's enough going on that you don't fall asleep. People rate natural settings as the best place to go when they want to reflect upon their own personal goals. So clearly, if you're sort of thinking about who am I and what's my identity, and you're in a natural setting thinking about that, that's going to be important. And then, in a kind of interesting way, often people think about getting away by themselves in a natural setting, but actually nature also fulfills this fundamental human need to connect. People talk about this consistently, that they don't tend to feel lonely when they're outdoors. When I say natural setting, I'm obviously being very simplistic, but I think you can all draw a picture to mind. It could be a park, woods, just a place where you're not seeing a lot of buildings and other people. And people talk about feeling connected to everything else in the world, everything else in the universe. So if this is, as it is, a fundamental need that all human people feel, is like, how are we connected to others? Nature can help to fulfill that sense of connection. And that's going to be important to your sense of who you are. So I developed this environmental identity scale to try and tap the extent to which people felt that interdependence and connection to the natural world, talking about things like, do they appreciate nature? Do they actually spend time in nature? Do they act in a way to protect nature? But also, how does their self-concept reflect this connection? And I've been doing a lot of research on this. Other people have been doing research with it. And it does predict what you would kind of want it to be to be meaningful. It relates to environmental concern. It relates to pro-environmental behavior. It relates to species conservation support, policy support. And interestingly, the higher your environmental identity, the more similar you rate zoo animals as being. And there's nothing about zoo animals in the scale itself. So what it's showing is that you feel more similar to other natural identities when you have a strong environmental identity. So I spent a lot of time thinking about environmental identity because I think identity makes things important. You know, there's a lot of stuff going on all the time. How do we decide what to pay attention to? We pay attention to things that are self-relevant. So identity really directs our attention. It also affects our interpretations of what we see. The example of maybe the Norwegians, it fits here that you think, I want to defend my collective identity as a Norwegian, and obviously this is an average tendency, not like everybody. Therefore, I'm going to take a particular position on climate change. So you're protecting your identity. That's affecting how you're responding to information. And then certainly, identity can motivate behavior. So I'll give you some examples. One online survey I did, I just wanted to see how environmental identity correlated with people's reactions to climate change, and it did significantly correlate with the extent to which they perceived harm from climate change, but also how their emotional response. So the more interdependence they felt with the natural environment, the stronger their negative emotional reaction to the idea of climate change, which of course makes sense. Oh, I think I missed a... Oh, I think I may have lost a slide there. Nope, I did. All right, I'm just going to tell you what this, in this one slide that somehow vanished, was a survey of zoo visitors, over 3,000 actually. And we were looking at their responses to climate change, and we also measured their sense of connection. We didn't use the full environmental identity scale, but we used a couple of items saying things like, I feel connected to nature, or I feel connected to the animals at the zoo. And that tendency to feel connected was correlated with how much they had given thought to the idea of climate change, how much they wanted to find out more about climate change, so that's the sort of attention element. Their emotional involvement, so how much they said they worried about global warming, how much they felt that it might harm them personally, and also their agreement with the statement that, yes, citizens like me need to be doing something about climate change. So their feeling of sort of personal responsibility and involvement. And so here's an example of how identity can motivate behavior. This is kind of a classic one. So back in 2007, this market research firm studied why were people buying Priuses, and as you can see, the most common reason was that it makes a statement about you. So that's saying your behavior reflects on you. It reflects on how people perceive you. And if you feel like you're an environmentalist and you want people to know that you're an environmentalist, then you have to buy a Prius. It's kind of low. So that's hopefully convincing you that identity does matter in affecting behavior in ways that are important to the environmental conservation. Now, one of the great things about identities, because we have multiple identities and we're not always thinking about all of them equally salient, you can target people's identity. And so this is a beautiful landscape in Wales. In a recent study, they ran discussion groups in Wales to talk about environmental messages, and they found that the Welsh responded more positively when it was sort of tied to their national identity. So think about the Welsh heritage. I would do a Welsh accent, but I can't. The wonderful Welsh heritage of scenery And people found that a more compelling message than one that focused on their personal aspiration or their lifestyle. The Adopt a Highway program, and I meant to double check, I think that was founded in Texas. Does anybody know? No. So anyway, but the Adopt a Highway program is basically about taking that piece of highway and tying it to your identity. Because what does adoption mean except to take something and make it personally your own? And that apparently has worked really well. The Adopt a Highway program motivates people to protect the highway because it now reflects on them. But in some more kind of tricky ways, you can actually manipulate the way people think about themselves in ways that have implications for their environmental behavior. So here's a study that some of you may have seen. It got a lot of press. It was done by Goldstein, Cialdini, and Dimitrius, and it involved reusing hotel towels. And so I'm sure you all have been in hotel rooms, and then usually when they were starting this program, they would have little signs saying, please help us save the planet by reusing your towel. And so these researchers actually wanted to see, well, how effective are different messages in getting people to recycle? And so they asked people, help save the environment by reusing your towel, and 30% reused their towel. Then they had another condition that says, join your fellow guests in helping to save the environment. 75% of the hotel guests did reuse their towel, and suddenly, that's a huge, that's almost a 50% increase in the people who are reusing their towels, because they wanted to do what the other hotel guests were doing. But the really weird part is, when they said 75% of the guests in this room used their towel more than once, that's still a significant increase. So somehow, knowing that somebody else in this room, did something, makes me feel that I should do it too. It highlights a norm that's more relevant to my personal identity. So here are some examples of the ways in which we can shape personal identities. I might ask you, did you recycle anything yesterday? Or you didn't recycle something yesterday? Yeah, exactly. So you can feel pretty good about yourself. You're a real pro-environmentalist. Because you recycled. Did you contribute to an environmental organization yesterday? No. So now you're thinking, oh God, I'm not a very good environmentalist. So what the study did was to give people similar prompts that led them to think about themselves as either above average in terms of environmental behavior or below average. Same exact people, it was the questions they were asked that affected the way they perceived themselves. And the way they perceived themselves then affected their pro-environmental choices. If they thought, yes, I'm a good environmentalist, and you ask me if I want to have a, reusable mug instead of that styrofoam one, yes, I'm going to do it. But if they're thinking, oh gosh, I'm not a very good environmentalist, just give me the styrofoam mug, just bring it on. So you're changing people's self-perceptions just by the way you ask the question. Here's one I like. How do you compare, no impact monitor, how do you compare the no impact man in terms of your use of environmental resources? Not very good. You're not good environmentalists. What about compared to Donald Trump? Yeah, you're doing pretty well. So in this one, British citizens compared themselves to Americans, and they felt really good about themselves because they used so many fewer resources than Americans. Or they compared themselves to Swedes, in which case they didn't feel so good about themselves. So their self-image as part of their national identity is being manipulated there. And when they were comparing themselves to Americans, they reported stronger values, behavioral incentives, and actual behavior than when they compared themselves to Swedes. So they were kind of led to believe that they were pro-environmental. And so what you notice there is it's almost counterintuitive. If you encourage people to feel positively about their own environmental identity, it's more likely to lead to more environmental behavior than if you try and shame them, in which case they're just like, yeah, I'm terrible. I'm going to go sit in the other part of the cafeteria, and with all the people who like drag racing. Right. So all of these, this has been a lot of work leading me to believe that identity can be put to work in advocating for environmental protection, and particularly for conservation. And so I want to sort of describe 3 different projects that I've been involved in. And I have to say ahead of time that none of them is like, oh, this is the answer to all your problems. So I suspect some people here are thinking, yes, psychology will tell us how to save the world. In fact, I once wrote an article called Can Psychology Save the World? But I was more naive at that time. But I think they suggest some directions that we're interested in going. So one has to do with naming rights, one has to do with zoo experiences, and one is an educational intervention. And here's just a little baby example of how you can evoke identity. How do we care for our giant pandas? It's like, now it's my responsibility. What can I do to save them? So the first one involved giving people the chance to name a species of wasp. And this project was sort of brought to me by a biologist who had been doing work on wasps. She discovered this new subspecies, and she wrote me and said, what do you think? If we gave people the chance to name the wasp, would that affect the way they felt about kind of protecting the species and protecting the environment? So I said, you think so? So let's try and test it. And so she was finished, so we did the study in Finland. It's hard to do a wonderfully designed experiment here. So we did a suboptimal kind of quasi-experiment. An ecology class at one high school was going to be given the opportunity to name the wasp. There was only one ecology class, so for our control, we had a geography class at the same school, as well as an ecology class at a different school. So each class heard a lecture, and then about climate change and the importance of protecting biodiversity. We measured knowledge, concern, their intention to behave in a pro-environmental way, and their environmental identity. And the results, I'm afraid, were a little bit mixed. So we didn't find any differences in knowledge and concern. Everybody seemed pretty positive about, they all paid attention to the lecture. Maybe they thought they were going to be tested on it. In fact, they were tested on it. And they all showed concern at that time. They just had heard this lecture. It had been very salient to them. We did try controlling for environmental identity as a way of controlling for pre-existing differences, and then we found that the experimental group scored significantly higher in behavioral intentions. So that was kind of exciting to us, suggesting that the experimental manipulation had an effect. And these were the people who had the chance to name the wasp. They indicated more likelihood of doing more to protect the environment in the future. Then we were very excited about testing them again in the fall, by which point half of the class had disappeared and could no longer be tested. We did not find a lasting effect in the fall, but we did find, even in the fall, so about 3 months later, maybe more, 4 or 5 months, their environmental identity did still predict variability, so did still predict their greater likelihood to engage in pro-environmental behavior, even after you control for previous behavior. And one of the things, one of the psychological rules of things that are, is that the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. So whenever something adds additional predictive ability to past behavior, it seems pretty important. All right, so that's one example. I think the results are, again, not strong enough to go and say, yes, for one thing, how can you give everybody an opportunity to name the species? It's not very effective, but it does say that could be one way to tie biodiversity threats to personal identity. If we had more control over the educational setting and could do more follow-up education, it seems to me that there would be a potential to have a greater impact. So zoos can be very effective sites. As Elizabeth mentioned, I like to go to the zoo. And there are several reasons for this. One that is kind of, before this, people go to the zoo. So as a psychologist, we're often faced with the reality that it's hard to study. We want to study everybody. We want to make conclusions about everybody, but you can't study everybody. Usually we end up studying college sophomores and first-year students. Sometimes a little bit right. And nothing, I like college sophomores and first-year students, but they're not representative of people as a whole. Sometimes you can get people in a specific setting, but almost all kinds of people go to the zoo, wide age range, wide educational level, even wide economic level, because a lot of zoos have free days. So people can get knowledge at the zoo, and not only do zoos provide information, people actually trust zoos. And there's research to show this. People consider zoos to be a trusted trustworthy source of information about not just animals, but in fact about environmental issues. And people recognize that that's part of what zoos are trying to do, is to encourage conservation. There's also the opportunity in the zoo to create that sense of personal relevance because people do have very emotional experiences in the zoo. Zoo visits tend to be very vivid. People remember the time an animal did something surprising, or maybe it was really stinky and that's why they remember it. So when you have a more emotional response to the animal being cute or scary or surprising, that emotion has an effect on your memory that makes the memory kind of stronger. And so it's more likely to be retained. And my argument would be that sense that people have the potential to develop that sense of connection to animals in the zoo. And zoos do a lot to try and promote that sense of connection as well. And finally, and this is something that I think zoos are maybe have not been as aware of as they could be in the past, is that zoos provide an effective way to target not just individuals but groups, because people visit the zoo in a group. And that means that you're not just creating memories, you're having conversations within your group. You're talking about your shared norms and values. People say things in the zoo like, oh, we have to come and look at our elephants and see how our elephants are doing. It's important that the animals be taken care of, or we just love these animals. I mean, sometimes it's as simple as that. We love these animals, but that's a shared value. And there's that wonderful side effect that to the extent you see all kinds of people around you who also love animals, you feel like your individual impact is magnified. If I come to the zoo and the zoo is telling me what to do to protect animals and everybody else in the zoo is learning the same thing, maybe we can actually make a difference. So previous research has shown that people do tend to form these social connections, personal connections, and enhance concern in the zoo. One measure of connection is called the inclusion of nature in the self scale. It's actually very similar to the environmental identity scale in conception, but very different in format. It's a series of overlapping circles, and you say they start out separate and they gradually combine. And one is labeled nature and one is labeled self, and you say which one describes your relationship with nature. So people who show more overlapping circles have more of a feeling of interdependence with nature. And in one study, those scores went up at the end of a zoo visit. People also talk about their connection to animals in very explicit ways. And sometimes when I hear these comments, I almost feel like somebody had to feed them this line. It's so exactly what I expect them to say. But he's just like a little human. We're all cousins. Look, this, the baby chimp has its blankie, just like Madeline has her blankie kind of thing. So there's really that sense of shared experience with the animals in some cases. People form these social connections. That's the primary reason they go to the zoo. And I was mentioning this to somebody earlier. A huge proportion of people, when they go to see the animals, and hardly anybody goes to the zoo by themselves, the first thing they do is they'll look at the person next to them and they say, oh, look, there it is. So what they're doing is taking their individual experiences with the animal and making it a social experience. They're sharing it with somebody. And they're sharing it with somebody because that just makes it a more important experience. And the other interesting thing they do, sometimes you'll take a picture and then they'll show the other person so the other person can literally have the same perspective as you have. So that's really building these sort of social connections between people at the same time as they're talking about their shared values. And then generally, environmental concern is higher among zoo members than non-members, and I think this is useful when we think about zoos and their ethically ambiguous data. It is important to remember that, to realize this, that people who belong to zoos and visit zoos seem to care about animals more than people who don't. And particularly those people who have either said they learned something in the zoo or said they feel a sense of connection with the animals are more likely to show environmental concern. So there are experiences at the zoo that are associated with environmental concern. And then the last thing is that, again, your tendency to not want to think about scary environmental issues because they're threatening can be overcome to the extent that you feel the zoo is providing you specific information about what you can do, that you see other people also getting involved. So I'm going to do this pretty quickly now. So one particular study about visitors to a Paris zoo. We studied people at the beginning of the visit and the end of the visit. So again, sort of quasi-experiment. It wasn't the same people as two different groups, but there's no reason to expect the groups were any different. So to the extent that they scored differently, we have interpreted that as meaning the zoo visit had affected them, especially since we compared the two groups and found no difference on a bunch of things. And they did show a difference. They increased in knowledge, concern, and self-efficacy over the course of the visit. Knowledge by itself, however, was not related to concern or behavior. So knowledge by itself didn't seem to be particularly effective. Concern was related to behavioral intention and with self-efficacy. And self-efficacy actually turned out to be the most important thing. So people's belief that there was something they could do to protect biodiversity was the strongest predictor of environmental concern and of intention to behave in pro-environmental ways. So that's something I think zoos can do, is that they can give people that message that there are behavioral responses you can make that will be effective. And the last project I want to tell you about is an idea about using the zoo as a classroom, and particularly, capitalizing on national identity. So the problem we were trying to address was the wildlife trade, which is, the U.S. is by no means has a hand clean when it comes to the wildlife trade, but it is a particular problem in China. Interestingly, the Chinese are also take great pride in their national biodiversity and feel a great deal of affection for it. And so what we wanted to do is see if we could link that pride to behavior. And China is distinctive, and therefore we're studying, because it's got such high biodiversity, because the species are, if anything, is iconic, and because the rapid changes in China are really contributing to some threats to biodiversity. So we surveyed about 600 visitors to either the Chengdu Zoo or the research base for giant panda breeding in Chengdu. And what we found is environmental concern predicted behavioral intention, environmental identity predicted environmental concern, and national identity predicted those things, but only to the extent that it correlated with environmental identity. So my interpretation of that is national identity can motivate you to take care of your environment, but only to the extent that your national identity promotes environmental identity. And some national identities do, and some maybe not so much. So we had goals for our educational intervention, which were to, I'm just going to skip that slide. We wanted to use psychological principles to increase concern for wildlife threats. And so these are a couple of the posters that were used. And obviously, I can't translate most of that myself, but a couple of things to point out. One is, we said, what can you do to help? So we're trying to address that self-efficacy thing right up front. What can you do? Another thing is my story. So each of the posters emphasized sort of one of the animals, the endangered animals, speaking about their experience and really trying to personalize it in order to get that sense of empathy for the animal. Here's another one. This is sort of overall poster, and it says, let's take photos and sign names to make a promise. So really good social psychology use there, that you're getting people to commit to taking a behavior. You're also having them do it in a public way so they see that all the other people have also committed to take a behavior. So we don't yet have the results. Actually, we have collected the data, they just haven't yet been analyzed, so we're hoping it made a difference. All right, I have just a couple things to say and then I'll wrap up. One is the most important takeaway message. I think that the implication of all of this is that it is worth thinking about how to promote an environmental identity in order to encourage environmental conservation. And very simply, what can you do to promote environmental identity? Encourage people to spend time in nature. Encourages a sort of sense of your culture or your national heritage is linked to the environment. And have social experiences with others where you share those experiences in nature and develop shared values. The trouble is, personal experience of nature is decreasing. And not just do people spend less time outdoors and in parks than they used to, even media is decreasing. So here's, many of you probably recognize this is Bambi, and this is Cars. And this may sound anecdotal. We actually did a study where we carefully coded the biodiversity present in Disney movies over 50 years, animated Disney movies, and found that the representations of biodiversity had decreased over time. Not just the amount of biodiversity, the number of scenes that were outdoors, but also the number of species present in those scenes. And there's a whole bunch of other research that similarly shows that even our contact with nature through children's picture books or magazines or television shows seems to be decreasing. Cultures can highlight the wrong identity. And so here's a nice picture from China, suggesting this is part of environmental education, take care of your trees and flowers. Here's an American poster. I shop, therefore I am. I think that certainly many societies, but perhaps especially American society, really emphasizes consumption as a way to define yourself. And that's really unfortunate. So what we need to do in that sort of circumstances is to really focus on ways to emphasize those social experiences in nature. And so here are just some examples of people appreciating and enjoying nature in social context. And that's the end of my talk. Thank you.